extremely late, so we've got about 10 minutes for questions. I wonder if there's anything immediately. There's a couple at the top.
I had a question for Claire, which was, what's the relationship between, the social and socialism? It's a bit off-piste from your examples, but is there any sense through your research that the social becomes a kind of surrogate for socialism post-89?
Yeah, good question. Am I able to answer that? Yeah, Charles is going to answer that question. No, I mean, it's obvious, no? We're going from the kind of activist to this kind of idea of more participatory models, thinking how do we include in viewers in the production and consumption of art. And then this afternoon, when we look at, I think the examples from Rebecca will talk about in Scotland will be about artist-organised spaces and the relational exhibitions in France. So these are artists talking to each other that we'll look at in those. So there's multiple modalities of this. But yeah, I think it does go from social understood as conviviality to social understood as, kind of as a methodology, to social as what was the other one? But as as just a kind of general, kind of national agenda, dealing with national cultural patrimony. I hope that answers your question.
Maybe can I just come in with one, because talking about socialism and talking about modernism, we come to the word failure quite rapidly, I think, and sad, tragic, etc. But nevertheless, and I wonder whether we could talk about these exhibitions in terms of failure. I mean, you wanted to have it both ways by saying you don't know whether it's regressive or progressive. This fact that it's an exclusive audience, but it's not necessarily an elite audience in terms of economic or political power. But I wondered whether what was interesting, and also from what Christian said, was the kind of the ambitions, which you could liken to the ambitions of Corbusier, against the reality. And that these seemed to be relatively far apart, much further apart than a traditional exhibition might be, or much further apart than our discussions of previous 89 exhibitions, such as Magician de la Terre. So I wondered if failure was a way in which would be a word that would describe your relationship to these exhibitions.
I don't know, it's difficult for me to say that, because I see them as kind of interesting historical examples of these are transitional forms that lead towards the kind of developments that you've had with the most recent documenters. It's interesting when you talk to the sort of curators of these exhibitions, they regard them all as failures, and actually often the artists regard them as failures as well. And so there's and although you don't get that sense so much when you're reading reviews of these shows, people think they're kind of an interesting new novel mode of doing exhibitions.
Christian, you were involved in it. Is failure something that resonates with you, or would you really reject it?
I wouldn't use the word failure. It's just a very hard or emotional place to visit in time. Like it is sad to look at the Le Corbusier, which is a total ruin. Especially if, like Renate said that before in Doc 2, when it's your own history, but, like all these projects were done as collaborative attempts, and I would like to go back and say, for instance, Matthias Poletna was an advisor, Arno Friens was an advisor, Oliver Zieslik was an advisor. It's interesting that they were all men, and the female role was that of the assistant, the coffee maker, the kind of secretary, unfortunately. Sad, I think things have changed. But one thing in particular, I think, is in comparison to today. I was just doing finally my first project with Valerie, at the Haus der Kultur in der Welt, House of World Cultures in Berlin last year. And there I also collaborated, but in the end I did not participate in a parade of Arto Lindsay. Arto is now, at every biennial, there's no show without a parade of Arto. I love him dearly, but I mean, it's kind of like a formulaic by now. You look at Chicago, Sculpture in Action, there was Daniel Martinez, and in reading the books, 2 years in preparation, 35 different groups, like 3 different neighborhoods, and they basically clashed. So there's like a huge minefield or a quarry of incredible, rich materials that should be unearthed. Of course, you can also talk about Jeremy Dill, you can talk about parades in many ways, but in a way, not, when you draw the line between, like in somehow 95 or so, you just look at relational aesthetics thing was a failure. It was very highly problematic, but I think very productive, like.
That's right. Problematic but productive. Yes, another question.
Well, talking about this, what you say, the failure or not, I wonder that in those exhibitions, better use the word that you use, in those projects, there is a new idea of a different type of audience, a different type of viewer. So maybe you were talking about that the viewer was this, like a flaneur, like a connoisseur, but I wonder if those projects changed the way that audiences were appreciating these projects, these works of art.
Yeah, I hope I try to put that over. That the idea of the work of art is also changed and extended into something that is long-term, durational, process-based, is a project, and the same way spectatorship has changed. And I think what it sets up is a kind of an idea of multiple audiences. That's why I showed you the little bit of the clip of Fermini at the end. So you've got the kids breakdancing in the apartment, and then you've got the art world swanning around looking at the show, and multiple audiences rather than a singular audience.
The people who visit those exhibitions, taking from this engagement with the social, are reacting to those exhibitions?
Who are you referring to? Which people?
The people who visit museums or exhibitions at the moment.
Well, I think that's very overdetermined because in Britain it's to do partly with the sort of the populism of the museum, and Tate is a kind of exemplary model of that, and things like the Turner Prize generating huge new audiences for art. So I think I wouldn't want to ascribe that shift purely to this bunch of exhibitions that we're talking about. That would be one of many factors.
Is there another question in the audience? I can take one more. Yes.
I just wanted to turn Charles's question slightly in the reverse and ask what it would mean, in fact, for you, for these exhibitions to have been successful, not to talk in terms of failure, but what is the projected success of such projects?
Who's that to?
Chris. Maybe Chris, yeah?
Success would be maybe like it's measured or has been measured, like Charles said, until the kind of meltdown of the Lehman Brothers in kind of dollar and euros, in cash. So in that way, this period of time or these projects were unsuccessful, but I think they were very productive in kind of like experimenting and breaking new grounds. In that way, I think they were a total success, but you cannot measure it in money. My gallerists, people who collect me, they say, yeah, but why have your numbers or your group of artists, friends, why are your prices not in the 6 digits? Like the relational aesthetics, everything from Ricketts is in 6 digits. Do you measure success by currency, or are there others? I think, that now the time has come, and in next generation of art historians and thinkers will have to deal with this, and it's up to them to decide. It's not up to us, the kind of active participants. But it's a very interesting and challenging question. But I mean that definitely the audiences also. Just if I have one more minute, I think we have to look at in turn when we're discussing audiences. Talking about these historic models, or also like recent Berlin biennials where you have like 100 days, or Documentas where 100 days, 100 events, 100 guests. Only a local audience can maybe possibly engage in this kind of program, and the visitor or a normal museum goer can never kind of cover all that. So you have the local and the kind of global visitor.
But would a measure of success be the transformation of the consciousness of the audience in some way? To put it in really clumsy terms, I mean, one thing that always strikes me is to what extent is are the inhabitants of Kassel transformed by the Documenta?
Not very much when you go there between times.
I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I wouldn't want to presume, but it's interesting that we don't have an answer to it necessarily, which is kind of agreed. And I wondered whether, you know, the inhabitants of l'unité d'habitation in having experienced this project, would one measure of success be a measure that I don't think is ever made, but would one measure of success be the after effects of that in their own perception of the world?
I mean, if you want to call it in these terms success, it's now a designated design district of France. You know, it's all protected now, and so it's being looked at in other terms, although in the early 90s people wanted to, you know, collectors and rich people wanted to buy Le Corbusier social housing units, but they wanted to break down the walls and make kind of villas on top, and they were only interested in the upper floors. But now that Saint-Étienne, the neighboring town, has been, you know, like a hub for new technologies and design. So in a way, now after so many years, they kind of like self-identity has, maybe they're more proud to live there. Before it was a very, very, very sad place to visit.
That's a measure.
Even with exciting architecture. But I think this is, I would measure that as...
I've just got one very brief point to end, which I think relates to sort of how we discuss, how we research, how we look at these exhibitions now, because an orientation towards the social has methodological implications for how you deal with art in culture and its reception in the public. I mean, this is one reason why I kind of find myself turning to Boltanski and Chiapello, is that we have to turn to the social sciences for some degree of vocabulary for dealing with art in the social sphere. This is kind of my methodological axe to grind. But I think there are also limitations to that, because one way of answering these questions, that, or at least your variation on Jill's question, is, well, how do we measure the transformation? Well, of course, we can do social sciences, we can do questionnaires, we can do that kind of research. But then, you know, how boring would that be? Then we have pages of statistics. So I think this is really what it indicates to me is a kind of the limits of where we can go with sort of existing art historical methodologies and what we need to bring in, and where we decide to drop those social sciences methodologies in conjunction.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that's something we can return to in the plenary session at the end. Meanwhile, I'm afraid in order to give you any time to grab a sandwich, we have to stop. We will try our best to gather back here at 14:30, 2:30. So please be on time. Thank you very much.